Hello, everyone, and welcome to the online Maronite Enrichment Days. I am Armando El Khouri. We are glad that you are able to join us on Zoom. We also greet and welcome our live viewers on YouTube, on the YouTube channel of the Maronite Eparchy of Los Angeles. Before I pass the mic to Monsignor Peter Azar, I want to thank our guest speaker, Rodrigue Constantine, for presenting his talk on the 3 levels of moral growth. I would like to thank also our bishops, Mansour and Zaidan, for sponsoring these talks. As a reminder, you may ask questions at the end of the talk. To do so, click on the reactions icon under the video feed. When the small pop-up window opens up, click on Raise Hand. I will call on you in the order I see you on my screen, and I will request that you unmute yourself. Once unmuted, you may ask your question. Thank you again for joining us, and here is Monsignor Peter.
Good morning, everyone. Once again, it gives me a great pleasure and honor to welcome our own bishops and all of our participants from various corners of the world. Today marks the last talk for our friend, Reverend Dr. Rodrigue Constantine. Thank you to my brother priest, Reverend Dr. Armando El Khouri, for facilitating these sessions for us to benefit from. Last but not least, many thanks to all of you for supporting us with your commitment and active participation. I hope that you found the series of talks both valuable and beneficial. We look forward to your participation in person in the future as we hold other sessions. Thank you again, and God bless.
Thank you, Father Armando. Thank you, Monsignor. Thank you, everyone, for making it this far to the last installment of my series of talks on John of Apamea. The talk today is the one that most scholars focus on when they study John of Apamea, and this is the 3 levels of moral growth, which is prominently featured in the dialogue on the soul. So I'll proceed in, as follows today. So the topic is, like I said, the 3 levels of moral growth in John of Apamea's dialogue on the soul. These 3 levels are what I translate as somaticity, psychicality, and pneumaticity. And I have to apologize in advance for the clunky English terminology, but it's supposed to translate 3 Syriac words: fagrunuto, nafshonuto, ruhunuto. I chose the Greek roots of these English words. If I went the Latin route, I would have talked about corporality, animality, and spirituality. But for some reason, I talking about the animal level in moral growth did not sit well with me. So these what these 3 levels are supposed to translate in Syriac. And what I'd like to show primarily is that this moral growth is driven by the healing of vicious passions that we had been talking about in the first and third talk. So for him, growing from one level to another consists in successively and progressively healing the vicious passions. First, I will talk about just some general considerations on moral growth and virtue in the dialogue on the soul. Some of it is a reminder of previous talks to set up basically the background of how John perceives moral growth. Then I will speak about the characteristics of the first levels of moral growth. Then the second level, psychical level, and finally the pneumatic level. So let's refresh our memory on how John views virtue and moral growth in the dialogue on the soul. First, John does not claim to have invented these three levels. He says that they are present in Scripture. And he references the first letter to the Corinthians, where he finds these categories of people that Paul talks about. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul says to the Corinthians, for you are still in the flesh, for while there are among you envy and contentions and divisions, are you not Semitic and walking in the flesh? As you know, the Pauline concept of flesh symbolizes not the material body per se, but our propensity to sin. And John sees in this category, according to Paul, a state of being, a level of moral growth where there's still evil deeds and evil thoughts. Also, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about psychical people, and he describes the man at this level as the man who is psychical receives not spiritual things, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot know them because they are judged by the Spirit. So Paul describes the man at this level, the nefshono, as someone who is lower and inferior to the third and most advanced level of spiritual growth, the pneumatic man, or the spiritual man, who, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he's a man who judges everything while he is not judged by anyone. Now, to be clear, Paul does not intend these three categories of people to be three levels of moral growth or a taxonomy in any way. So although the names or the terminology is present in Paul, the conceiving of them as a continuum of moral growth, that's the work of John of Apamea. Now, of course, they have been before divisions of moral growth, whether in some of the Greek fathers or some of the Syriac fathers, but no one has put them with such depth. And again, no one has used this terminology before of somatic cycles and pneumatics until John of Apamea. Although I have argued somewhere else that it exists in a much more primitive form in Gregory of Nyssa on the making of man. Now, what is this trajectory of moral growth? So we're talking about three levels here that are successive and progressive. By successive, I mean that you go from one to another, you move to another, from first to the second to the third. You cannot be in two levels at the same time, as some other scholars have argued. You are either at the level of the body or at the soul or level of the spirit. You cannot be in two levels at the same time. Of course, could one regress? If one progresses to the level of the soul back to the level of the body, it's possible, although John does not talk about that. But the point is, these are successive levels and not simultaneous levels. Second, they are progressive. When you go from one level to another, you are growing in spirit, you are progressing. And in that sense, John says that only if you are brought near the pneumatic conduct, the highest level, the third level, a small number to the psychical level, and the whole world to the somatic level. So for him, basically, we are all born, most of us are at the somatic level, the lowest level. Some of us rise to the psychical level, but only if you reach that highest level of pneumatic conduct. And I'll discuss why this is at the end. And this progression in general, to give you an idea of what one is progressing from to what, it's a progression from vice to virtue. We start by having vices, and then we remove them and we attain virtue. We start by being in error to finding the truth. We start with the visible things of this world and attachment to visible things, to then our attachment to invisible and spiritual things. And we go from the deeds that we perform through the body to knowledge, which is proper to the soul. So that's the general trajectory of that um, of moral growth. Now, again, a quick reminder of how John views virtue and vice, because again, they are important because moral growth is a movement from virtue to vice. So how does he understand virtue and vice in the dialogue of the soul? It's very important to remember that for John, the soul has ontological goodness, ontological virtue, means that the the default state of our soul is to be virtuous, is to be good. He says that God has placed virtue in us at the creation of our soul. God has given us a virtuous soul. Yet, because of the soul's association with the body, because the soul exists in a body and the body has needs and desires, then these vicious passions stir up the soul. This is where vice comes in through the soul's association with the body. But because the soul is naturally and ontologically virtuous, these vicious passions, although they stir up the soul, they remain extrinsic to it. They remain outside of it, even though they stir it. They don't become part of its nature. They don't become part of its essence, because he says, if vice were endemic to us, were intrinsic to the nature of our soul, then we can never get rid of it. And the truth is, we can and we must get rid of it. And he gives this beautiful image of the vicious passions as scars and wounds on the body. He says, just like scars and wounds are on the body, but not from the body, they're not part of the health of the body. A healthy body would not have scars and wounds. So also, vicious passions stir up the soul, but they are not part of the essence of the soul. They remain extrinsic to it and they remain unhealthy. We need to get rid of them. And so for him, virtue and vice are not simply individual deeds, virtuous deeds or vicious deeds. They're not single acts, as we sometimes tend to think of virtue and vice. For him, virtue and vice are primarily moral orientations of the whole person. The whole person is vicious, or the whole person is oriented towards vice. And he talks about the person turning towards the body, and that's how we become vicious, or turning towards the soul, our essential true person that is virtuous, and that's how we become virtuous. So with that in mind, if the soul is naturally good and vice is external to us, then all we need to do to become virtuous is to remove all the obstacles that stand in the way of our virtue manifesting itself. Because he says virtue is already in us, but because of the passions, because of vice, this virtue is eclipsed. So virtue for him is different from how Aquinas or Augustine think of virtue, or even Aristotle, as something we have to acquire. For them, again, based on the Aristotelian model, a virtue is habituation. I become virtuous by performing virtuous acts over and over and over again, and that's how it becomes second nature to me. It's something I have to acquire. Not for John of Apamea. For him, virtue is already in us. All we need to do is to remove all the obstacles to it. And he gives this beautiful analogy on the interaction between vice and virtue, and he likens it to how clouds can hinder the light of the sun to be seen. Let me quote him. Just as when the sun rises, if there are dense clouds and dark fog in the air, these become hindrances for its light to be seen by us. Likewise, the habits and upbringing in which a person is brought up hinder the virtue of his soul from being seen in his person. Also, just as when the clouds and dark fog roll away from the middle of the sky, the brightness of the sun becomes fully visible on earth. Similarly, if evil habits are removed from the person, the soul's whole virtue easily becomes visible in him. So as you can see here, it's more the via negativa of moral growth. Moral growth is not, again, acquiring virtue by habituation, but removing the obstacle for our virtue to be visible in us. So that's why when he talks about moral growth, basically what he's trying to teach his disciples is how to remove vicious passions in order for their virtue to shine. So where does moral growth start? Where do most of us start in our journey towards moral growth? Scholars disagree on a couple of categories at the beginning of this three-tiered um, division of moral life, because John talks about a category he calls the conduct of demons. And scholars disagree whether this is a part of the initial level of moral growth. Is it something that people can grow out of, or is this is a category that is condemned out of growing morally? This will become clear as I read his description of the people who are in the conduct of demons. He says, those whose whole intelligence errs in evil thoughts, if they love to put them into action, they stand in the conduct of demons. So he's talking about people who live in complete error. So in their reason, the reason is completely blind to the truth. Not only that, when their reason erroneously motivates them to commit sin, they not only commit sin, but they love doing so. So they do not resist their passions or their vice in any way. And for him, these are not even human beings. He says about the people in the conduct of demons in another place, these do not count even among human beings. So this may be a category for him that has that does not have a lot of hope for growing moral. In any way, it is distinct from the what he calls the first level, the Semitic level, and this is how this level is described. He says, "Those whose whole intelligence meditates upon evil things, if they do not love executing their stirrings, they are Semitics." So this is a juxtaposition of these two categories. Both both in both categories, reason is in error. In the first one, it's in complete error. The second one, intelligence only meditates on evil things. We think about evil things. We think about doing evil things. But unlike the first category, in the second one, people do not love committing evil things. People resist doing evil things. And for him, if there's this slight resistance to doing evil things, then you are what he calls a somatic at the level of the body, and then there is hope for you to grow more. How does one grow out of this level? Basically, by striving against the basic and easier passions that are the passions of the body. The passions of the body are the ones that have to do with vital needs and appetites, sleep, drink, sex, pleasure, food, etc. Now, by striving against these passions, one can grow out of that initial level. He says, John says, if one strives against the evil of his thoughts and he does not abandon his mind to his stirrings, and he constrains himself with bonds and does not accomplish their will, the will of the passions, this person is close to the psychical degree. So if it's a simple willpower at this point to control one's will, to not accomplish the will of the passions, and by resisting and striving against these thoughts, which is something not existent at the lower level of the conduct of demons, but not only resisting the thoughts as somatics do, but also to not accomplish evil, because at the somatic level, people still commit evil, even though they do not love it. But when they get to a point where they don't accomplish the will of the passions, means they have some control over their behavior, then they are growing out of this first initial level, the somatic level, into the second level, the psychical level, or the level of the soul. Now, what are the features of people who are at the level of the soul? There are two dimensions the dimension of the conduct and the intellectual or cognitive dimension of the person at this level. When it comes to conduct at the level of the soul, the person has a virtuous conduct. The person performs virtuous deeds. John calls this the virtuous conduct of the outer person as opposed to the inner person, because the outer person refers to the body, while the inner person refers to the soul. He thinks of virtuous deeds as the activity of the soul through the body. And this makes sense because if you think about it, when you feed the hungry, you're doing it through your body. When you visit the prisoner, you're doing it with your body. Of course, the body is not the source of virtue; it comes from the soul. But these virtuous deeds are still done through the body. It's the virtuous conduct of the outer person, which is different from the virtue of the inner person, and we'll talk about that later. He gives examples of virtuous conduct at this level of the soul, the second level. Unfamiliarity with gluttony and drunkenness, or with curses or insults, or with the pleasure of the flesh. And because this person is glorifying God with the words of his mouth. Other examples of virtuous conduct we perform through the body: chastity, giving to the poor, self-emptying of possessions, endurance against afflictions, acts of justice, caring for the needy. So that's how people at this level, that's how they conduct their lives with these virtuous deeds. Now, at the cognitive level, these are persons whose intelligence practices learning. These are people who have the desire to learn and to study the sciences. So even at the level of wisdom, we go from meditating on evil things at the Semitic level to people desiring to learn, people desiring knowledge, desiring to study the sciences. John says that these people are approaching wisdom. They're not wise yet, but they're approaching wisdom. Okay? Now, because of these two things, virtuous conduct and approaching wisdom, these people at the psychical level, the level of the soul, struggle with a few vices, and they are, of course, imperfect. They are imperfect because, one, they feel superior to those who commit evil deeds, or those who are inferior to them in what he calls visible deeds, the visible deeds, the virtue of the outer person. He says because at this level, people become it becomes easier for people to perform virtuous deeds. Then these persons are tempted to be proud, tempted to be haughty. They look at people who are evil and they feel superior to them. But the reason why they do that, he says, is because this person at the psychical level, the whole glory prepared for him from the abundant goodness of God and the world to come, he supposes that he receives it because of his deeds and not from the treasury of God's mercy. So he says the problem with these people, the reason why they feel superior and they are proud and haughty, is because he thinks he's accomplished that without, because he deserves it, not because of God's mercy. Because if this person were aware that his virtue comes from God, that he would not act superior to sinners, basically. Now, also because at the level of the soul, this medium level, people become smarter and more learned. They are proud and they see all those who disagree with them as errant and inferior to them. Also, they become too proud because of their intelligence, of their knowledge. And sometimes John places theologians at that level, people who hate others and scorn others who are disagreeing with them, because at this level, people deem their knowledge to be the only truth and that their wisdom is universal, that anyone who disagrees with them is obviously in error. And again, that's a manifestation of their pride. And he says, of course, the reason why they are so proud of their knowledge, it's because they think what their knowledge is perfect. But that's only ignorance, because ignorance of what is greater than the knowledge that they have, that of whether scientific wisdom or theological knowledge. He says the only reason why they think that they have the perfection of knowledge is because they're not aware of the real knowledge that comes from God, the knowledge of the mysteries, the knowledge of the world to come. And if these people at the level of the soul were aware of that knowledge, they would not be beset by the virtue, by the vice of presumption, of haughtiness, and of pride. Yet it is possible to grow out of this level, despite these vices and this imperfection, because at this level, people experience compunction of the soul. People cry real tears of penance because they are aware of their own vices, and because this compunction is motivates them to overcome these passions, and because this compunction is not true, and it's not present in the context of demons. That's why people don't work out of it. John talks about two important things two tasks one needs to undertake to grow out of this second level. He says, first comes the self-emptying of the desire for money. After the self-emptying of the love of money necessarily follows the self-emptying of the passion of the desire for praise. Like I said, at the somatic level, one attacks primarily the passions of the body that have to do with the needs of the body. At this more advanced level, one has to contend with more difficult vices, desire for money and the desire for praise. And as I explained last time, I think it's because both the desire for money and the desire for praise have to do with our last attachment to this world, attachment to possessions, but also attachment to our own ego. And that's why these are very difficult passions to overcome and to struggle against. But he says, if you want to grow out of this level, this is what you need. These are the passions that you need to contend with and overcome, to empty yourself out of. But if you successfully complete this level, and yes, it does sound like a video game where you go from one level to a more challenging, more difficult level. If one were to achieve this level successfully, they would reach a state he calls the purity of the soul. Like I said before, the soul is virtuous by nature, but we need to purify it from the scars and wounds and vices that eclipse that virtue. And this is what the state that one attains, that purity of the soul, at the end of this psychical level. This is the portrait of the person at that state. The person exists in the virtue of the intelligence, in humility and patience, in calm and understanding, in the joy of his hope, in the wakefulness of virtuous reflections, and in consummate affection for God and human beings. So this is no longer a level of virtuous deeds. This is a state of inner virtue, of inner peace, of inner joy and love, and virtuous reflection. Interestingly, so one attains this state after one has struggled against and defeated all evil passions, both the passions of the body and the passions of the soul. When one has defeated all these passions, this is what the state that one reaches. And John says he calls the spirit of the soul the completion, shulomo, the completion of the whole conduct with which God commands the person to conduct himself in this life. He's saying this state of the purity of the soul is all God expects from us in this life, defeating all the evil passions. Which, raises the question of the third level, because this is only the second level. There is one more level of moral growth. So this raises the question of does God expect us to reach the height of virtue in this life or not? But basically saying this purity of the soul is what God expects from us in this life and not more. This is because, and this is to anticipate the third level, is because of the role of grace in that third level, the pneumatic level, or the level of the soul, or the spiritual level. So what happens at this third level? Because one has defeated all the passions, what the movement here is from virtuous deeds at that level of the soul to knowledge. Now, for him, knowledge is superior to virtuous deeds. And why is that? There's some background in this in Neoplatonism. For Plotinus, the proper activity of the soul is knowledge, is contemplation of eternal forms. That's what the proper activity of the soul is. But because the soul is in the body, by necessity, the soul performs virtuous deeds through the body. But in its essence, its proper activity is knowledge. So knowledge is superior to virtuous deeds that are accomplished through the body. And I think it's because of that background, this Neoplatonic influence on John, that he conceives that at this highest level of moral growth, what is proper to it is knowledge. And because he says, there are no virtuous deeds in heaven. Nobody's feeding the hungry or clothing the naked in heaven. So that's why he views these virtuous deeds as part of this life, as part of our life in the body. So of course it's inferior to the proper life of the soul. He says, if a person is elevated above the activity of virtuous deeds and knowledge, he is no longer in the cyclical order, but in the pneumatic, because he has turned towards the knowledge of the nature of the soul. The soul is spiritual and knowledge is spiritual, so there's affinity between the two. And when one turns towards this knowledge of God, knowledge of the mysteries of God, then the person has been elevated to this third and final level, the pneumatic level. And he says that true virtue, true love, true humility exists only at this level, because true virtue comes from knowledge, comes from this highest form of knowledge, which again makes one wonder about the virtue that comes before that, the virtue that is possible here on earth. If it's not true virtue, what is the kind of virtue that we are capable of? Is it incomplete virtue? Is it? He doesn't say, but it begs the question. The way he describes persons at this level is actually beautiful. It's a state of intimacy with God. He says the pneumatic person is a beloved son who is freed from everything belonging to this world. He begins to become a sharer in the mysteries of God, because he will have a participation with God in his knowledge. He will enjoy a companionship with God through the revelation of mysteries. These are very powerful words, powerful phrases. Becoming a sharer in the mysteries of God, participating with God in his knowledge. Shautufutu, sharing the mysteries of God is the barozo daloho. And to become a companion with God through the revelation of mysteries. So it's a state of intimacy with God, and that's why for him this is a state that is only perfected in heaven, only perfected in the new life and the other world. Now, and that's why he says only a few people are granted this state here on earth. He talks about Jesus as being the perfectly pneumatic man, the only man who's truly pneumatic on this earth. But he also sometimes talks about Paul and the other apostles as being pneumatic persons. But he says that they were granted this state, this level of pneumaticity, because God entrusted the mission of predication. Because God needed them for a mission, that's why God granted them that grace. But otherwise, it's a grace granted to only a few people. He says that the pneumatic conduct is not for nature to seek, because that which is given to human beings in the other world is outside of nature. As I said before, God expects us to attain the purity of the soul, and we can do that with grace, but also it requires our own efforts. But he says that third level, the pneumatic level, this can be given only by grace. Because again, it's an eschatological state, and everything that is eschatological is given to us by grace. So if it's given to us in this world, it's a pure gift from God, something one need not expect. He said this order is called pneumatic, not because it is truly perfected in the spirit here in this world. This is not given until the new world, except for Jesus Christ was truly perfected in that level. So it's a state that's given by grace alone. So in conclusion, what I try to show here is that virtue is an ontological state of the soul, and then we need only remove the obstacles to it by healing ourselves from vicious passions, so that our virtue would shine just like the sun would shine in the middle of the sky when fog and dark clouds are removed from it. And by removing these passions, these obstacles, we grow morally towards the purity of the soul. Now, this is the last installment of my 3 talks. Well, if you were to remember anything from these 3 talks, are 3 things. One, there's beautiful diversity and richness within the Syriac tradition. Those of you who are more familiar with the Ephraims and the Jacob of Sarugs of the Syriac world would find in John a refreshing difference in the topics that he talks about and in the style in which he writes. And this is also partly because of the influence of Greek philosophy on his writings. Also, remember that John of Apamea is the one who introduced the study of psychology in Syriac Christianity as a requirement for asceticism and for moral growth. For him, it was because of him that Joseph Hazzaya and Philoxenus of Mabbug and Isaac of Nineveh and others talked about passions and talked about moral growth. Some of them adopted even his 3-tier division of moral life: ascetic, psychopos, and pneumatics. And lastly, what the dialogue on the soul, what it reminds us is that we need a vice ethics to complement modern virtue ethics. Like I said before, virtue ethics in current moral theology talks about how one acquires virtue, but it does not talk about how vice may impact one's acquisition of virtue. It doesn't talk about what the vices are and how one is to combat them. This is where we need monks and ascetics like John of Apamea to make this contribution. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, for this wonderful talk. I'm going to open this period with a question, if you don't mind. In the Fall of the Idols, for Jacob of Saruk, he says that money is the only idol that can contend with God. And then in John of Apamea, he talks about the desire for money and the desire for praise. I was wondering, does he talk about the connection between money and praise and power and control? And it seems like the more money I have, the more powerful I become, the more people I can control. And if I can extrapolate, it seems like I'm getting closer and closer to being like a small God on earth, because I can control people and I control land, and whatever my desires I can fulfill. Can you elaborate on this for a few seconds, please?
Yeah, of course. John does not talk about, does not elaborate on these passions, which is surprising considering he thinks they are very important passions to overcome in order to grow morally. But if I were to speculate, I think for him, the desire for praise is more pernicious because it even persists at the higher level of virtue. He says that even highly virtuous people are still tempted, even those who have given up possessions or the desire for possessions, they still are tempted when people are looking at them to want to be seen as virtuous and to want to be praised for their virtue. And I think that's maybe the reason why Jacob does not talk about it is because his concern is more pastoral. He's talking to monks as well as lay people. But John is talking mostly to ascetics, and that's why I think for him that passion of desire for praise is important and is even stronger than the desire for money, because again it involves the ego. One could give up possessions, but giving up one's ego is even more challenging.
Thank you. We open it up for questions. I would like to remind you to raise your virtual hand by clicking on the reactions icon and then raise the hand icon. I will call on you in the order I see the raised hands on my screen. Bishop Zaidan.
Thank you again, Father Rodrigue, for this quick questions. Did John put some practical ways to remove the vices, from, and especially in the first level, and you go back and forth in those two? For example, sometimes you feel you made the progress and you go back, and how do you deal with it in his own personal knowledge and writings?
Thank you for the question. John does not talk about regressing from one level back to another, but it's certainly possible. But he does not elaborate on that. As far as ways of dealing with the passions of the soul, because these passions are more sophisticated than the passions of the body, they are more intellectual. Again, when we talk about pride, when we talk about envy.
Even in the first level, passions of the body in some ways too. How to deal with it?
At the level of the body, he talks about few bodily things. Talks about things like fasting, standing in prayer, labor of fatigue. Basically, his approach to it is weakening the body, and which is something that we see in other desert fathers. The way the body is like this lion, and if the more you feed it, the more powerful it is. So you weaken it by starving it. So, but he does not talk much about this. Does not elaborate much about this, possibly because he's talking to maybe possibly more advanced ones. At the level of the passions of the soul, it has, because they are more cognitive. It talks about helpful thoughts, about combating evil thoughts with good thoughts, and these thoughts could be from the Bible, could be thoughts that a monologue that one says to oneself, like I talked about last time. When one feels that they want to be praised by others, you say to yourself, "I'm being stupid. I'm valuing people's praise over God's praise. I'm enslaving myself to them by desiring that praise from them. I've lost my own freedom." So, through other thoughts, and of course through spiritual mentorship. Through spiritual mentorship, of course.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I on?
Yes.
Yes, okay, wonderful. Hello, greetings from Italy, Father Rodrigue. I very much enjoyed all three of your presentations, very brief but very rich. And I know John of Apamea mainly through this wonderful article by Father Sidi Bejani, he published a number of years ago. I have dedicated a lot of time to studying St. Ephraim the Syrian, and I do teach a long class on Syriac spirituality regularly in Salzburg for the Syriac theology program. And while I was listening to your presentations, certain considerations came up with me. I heard echoes And questions arose that I do not expect you to answer, but they're questions mainly for all of us. First of all, I think my interest in Syriac theology is mostly hermeneutic. That is really my take on it. I listen to John of Apamea, and I do recognize certain hermeneutic principles that I think he shares with Ephraim, but further develops them. And I find echoes of Ephraim also like very beautifully in Ahukatraya. I find them in Morischok of Nineveh, of the Syrian. And there are certain elements that I believe that have old Syriac roots that also appear in John of Apamea, mostly the fact that he thinks ontologically, that virtue is given to us in creation and that it is marred for certain reasons, but it is there and it has to be revealed again, which is very beautifully pointed out. And I wonder, because I don't have answers myself, but there's a certain intuition or feeling I have that by going back to old texts, like mainly Ephraim, we would find many indications about the tripartite anthropology, so body, soul, and spirit. We find elements about the senses of the soul, all that inner life, also the zawa'eh, the inner movements and all of that. Elements also of dachyus lebo, so the purity of the heart, and then the shafyutho of the mind, where the light of God shines in. It's the elements are all there. Also, there is a beautiful text of Ephraim where he connects the rose with the knowledge, with revelation, with the concept of Yulpana, the doctrine of God, which also can become the doctrine of the church in the sense of a symbolical vision of world, and also what he calls truthful conduct. So the ethics have come out of the ontological being through grace, of course, it's all happening. And this constellation of concepts I came also across in Isaac the Syrian and also in Ahukatraya. So I believe it's kind of intuition. This is common to Syriac Christianity. And I would trust somehow, I dare to trust that if you would look at John of Apamea from this larger hermeneutic background, also symbolical thought, we might have surprises. And also specifically when we talk about medicine, Aho Shemunkasha has written his PhD with Sebastian Brock about healing in Ephraim's theology. So healing, the concept is very prominent in Ephraim. And Ute Possikal, who is present here with us, I think, in a book on philosophy in Ephraim, she also highlights that Ephraim did have a knowledge of Greek medicine, however limited. So perhaps that is also an element there that would very much enrich our picture understanding of John of Apamea. So thank you very much, and I hope you continue. And looking forward to reading your book, your PhD. Thank you very
so much. I appreciate it, Professor. Thank you. It definitely given me a lot of food for thought. And I'm glad that it's all recorded because I can go back to it and look at it more closely. Definitely. And you know, one of the things that I was not able to do in my dissertation is look more at the Syriac context of John of Apamea and the Syriac influences. I found that the Greek philosophy enlightened shines a brighter light on his thought than the Syriac writings, but it's definitely there. And so, yeah, looking at Ephraim, the Book of Steps also would definitely help. And I'm sure there are some of these elements that are present there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bishop Gregory Mansour.
Thank you so much, Father Rodrigue. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on the difference between an Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas approach of virtue ethics by habituation, and this kind of unique approach from John of Apamea, which tells me to respond to the professor's insights, that within Syriac tradition, John stayed very carefully within Syriac tradition, but even using wisdom from the Greek tradition. So if you could delineate the difference between the two approaches, it seems to me one is a virtue ethics, the other is a vice ethics. And with assuming that the soul is naturally healthy and good and needs to be cultivated by rooting out vices. But I'd like to hear your point of view.
Yeah, thank you. And definitely, again, and I would not say this is the Syriac approach, because as you know, Syriac approach is diverse, but this is definitely John's approach. It tends to be the ascetic approach. But yes, the one model in Western virtue ethics comes from Aristotle, and of course Aquinas based his own approach, more theology on it. They talks about virtue as being a quality of the mind, but is one that is acquired by repetitive acts of virtue. So you become courageous by repetitively performing acts of courage, just like you would learn tennis by repeatedly playing tennis. And basically, it's a movement of reason controlling the passions. The passions for him are part of the sensitive soul. For Aristotle, there are three souls: a vegetative soul that feeds and drinks, and then so responsible for growth. And you have the sensitive soul, which is the one that has the desires and the hopes and the fears and the angers. And then you have the rational soul, the will. So for him, growing in virtue is for reason and will to control the appetites. And again, you do that through practice, by acquiring the virtues, at least the four cardinal virtues, the moral virtue, because the theological virtues are, of course, grace from God. But the four moral virtues of fortitude, temperance, prudence, and what's the fourth? What's the fourth? Temperance, prudence. And anyway, it will come to me.
Justice. Justice.
Justice. Here you go. Thank you so much. So so pretty much something you don't have that you acquire. For John, yeah, his anthropology is different, and one of the things actually I'm most now intrigued about in John is how he would interpret the fall of Adam and Eve in paradise, because in Western Christianity, this is how we got corrupted. This is how sin entered into the world. In the Dialogue on the Soul, John does not talk about that. Maybe he does in other writings. But yes, for him, the fact that virtue is in us and that is hidden is a totally different approach to morality, but also to anthropology, how we view ourselves as human beings. Virtue is there; you just need to get out of its way. Of course, it does require effort. It does require it does require that one overcome the passions, but it's something that's already given to us. It's given to us by God at creation. Yes, that's the difference. That's the difference between the two.
Thank you.
So that's why he doesn't. I'm sorry. That's why he doesn't have, like in the West, a concept of infused virtues that tack on to the cardinal virtues. For him, it's all in a sense given by grace.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much for your wonderfully clear exposition of this wonderful writer. I was thinking really of how Isaac of Nineveh takes up a lot of this in his own writings. But the one thing that I see as a great difference is that Isaac is very keen on the need for cooperation with the spirit. So I wonder if you could say something about John and the role he sees of the grace of the Spirit in each of these three levels. Obviously, in the pneumatic level, it's going to be much more visible, but in a hidden way in the other two levels. So if you could say a bit more on that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Brock, by the Spirit, you mean the Holy Spirit?
Yes.
Okay. One of the, John does not, I have not seen in the dialogue on the soul a role for the Holy Spirit specifically. Although he does talk about grace, he does not talk about the role of the Holy Spirit as as the energy or the motivator behind moral growth. There's more talk of Christ, of course, but not specifically the role of the Holy Spirit. Now, and I'm no expert on Isaac of Nineveh, but also he modified a little bit the three levels because I think my understanding is that he has a more moral view. He talks about virtue at the level of the body, and virtue as at the level of the soul, and virtue at the level of the spirit. So how one can be virtuous in different dimensions of one's person, not as much in a successive progressive way, but John does not talk about specifically the role of the Holy Spirit in the dialogue on the soul.
So I wonder if it's when he uses the term grace, Isaac would say grace of the Holy Spirit. So maybe they're saying similar things. But
that's entirely possible. That's entirely possible. But he does not spell it out, like I said. Yes. Thank you. And thank you for all the wonderful work you've done on John of Apamea. Of course, I've used many of your writings in my dissertation. You're in many of my footnotes. So it's a great honor for me that you are.
I hope I haven't misled you.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. The opposite.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other virtual hands raised. In the name of Bishops Mansour and Zaidan and the Rector of the Seminary, Monsignor Azar, I thank all of you for joining us today. The Merit Enrichment Days is meant as an annual event to educate its attendees on important Syriac topics. We hope that we can host you in Washington, D.C. next year from April 26th to 29th, 2022. You may view Rodrigue's talks and download his presentation notes on thehiddenpearl.org. Lastly, we thank you, Rodrigue, for your 3 enriching talks on John of Apamea, the diseases of the soul, psychopathology, therapy, and moral growth, and the 3 levels of moral growth. Thank you very much. And until April 2022, goodbye.
Thank you very much. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you.